There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from effort itself, but from the wrong kind of effort. The pushing, the grinding, the white-knuckled determination to make things happen on your timeline, according to your plan, through your sheer force of will. You have felt it. The job application that you crafted perfectly and never heard back from. The relationship that you tried to save by giving everything you had until there was nothing left. The business that you built through sleepless nights and sacrificed health, only to watch it crumble despite your best efforts. The dream that you chased with such intensity that you chased it away. This is the exhaustion of forcing, and it is the most expensive energy you will ever spend, because it spends not just your time and your strength, but your faith. It convinces you that if things are not working, you must push harder. And in that pushing, you miss the signal that the universe has been sending you all along. Stop. Let go. Let something greater than your will take the lead. This is not a call to passivity. It is not an excuse for laziness, for abdication, for the spiritual tourism of waiting for miracles while doing nothing to prepare for them. The distinction between forcing and allowing is subtle but absolute. Forcing is the attempt to control outcomes through the sheer compression of your personal will against the resistance of reality. Allowing is the alignment of your will with a larger intelligence, the recognition that your job is not to make everything happen, but to become ready for what is already happening. The cultivation of a state of being that makes you available to guidance rather than deafened by your own demands. One leads to exhaustion and bitterness. The other leads to peace and progress that feels almost effortless because it is not your effort alone that produces it. The first thing you must understand is that your ego is a terrible navigator. It is loud, insistent, and convinced that it knows the best route to every destination. It operates from a map that is drawn from your past experiences, your inherited fears, your cultural conditioning, and your limited perspective. It sees obstacles as enemies to be conquered, rather than as signals to be read. It sees delays as failures, rather than as preparations. It sees rejection as catastrophe, rather than as redirection. And because it is so certain, so urgent, so terrified of losing control, it forces, it pushes, it manipulates. It tries to bend reality to fit its map, instead of adjusting its map to fit reality. The result is predictable. The ego forces a relationship with someone who is not ready, not compatible, or not interested, and creates a dynamic of pursuit and withdrawal that destroys whatever genuine connection might have existed. The ego forces a career move based on status rather than calling, and finds itself successful on paper but empty in spirit. The ego forces a creative project before its time and produces something technically competent but spiritually dead. The ego forces healing before the wound has finished teaching its lesson, and finds that the healing does not hold. In every case, the forcing produces a distorted version of what was sought, a hollow victory, a relationship without depth, a success without satisfaction, a life that looks right but feels wrong. The alternative is to recognize that there is an intelligence operating in the universe that is greater than your ego, and that this intelligence is not hostile to your desires, but is working with a perspective that your ego cannot access. The Stoics called this the Logos. The Taoists call it the Tao. Theists call it God. The language matters less than the recognition. Something is moving through reality, organizing events, creating synchronicities, opening doors and closing others, and this something knows more than you do about what you actually need, as opposed to what you think you want. Your job is not to fight this intelligence, not to outsmart it, not to force your will against it, but to align with it, to listen for its guidance, to become sensitive to its signals, and to have the courage to act when it moves, and the patience to wait when it pauses. This alignment begins with the difficult work of distinguishing between your ego's voice and the voice of guidance. The ego's voice is urgent. It is anxious. It is obsessed with outcomes and timelines. It speaks in the language of should and must and have to. It creates pressure. It generates fear. It tells you that if you do not act now, everything will be lost. The voice of guidance, by contrast, is quiet. It is patient. It is unconcerned with timelines because it operates in a timescale that your ego cannot perceive. It speaks in the language of invitation rather than demand. It creates peace even in uncertainty. It does not eliminate fear, but it situates fear within a larger context of trust. And it is often most audible in the moments when the ego has exhausted itself, when the forcing has failed, when you have finally reached the end of your own resources and are willing to consider that you might not know best. The practice of listening to this voice requires the cultivation of stillness, not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of attention. The modern world is designed to prevent this stillness. It fills every moment with noise, with stimulation, with the constant demand for reaction. Your phone, your notifications, your feeds, your obligations, they all serve the ego's need for control by keeping you in a state of perpetual motion. In this motion, you cannot hear guidance. You can only hear the ego, and the ego is always shouting. To hear something else, you must create spaces of silence. This means literal silence, time without media, without conversation, without the constant input that drowns out the subtle signal. But it also means internal silence, the quieting of the ego's commentary, the suspension of the planning, the worrying, the rehearsing, the reviewing that occupies most of your mental bandwidth. This stillness is not empty. It is full. It is full of the presence that emerges when the ego's noise subsides, and in this presence, guidance becomes perceptible, not as a voice necessarily, though for some it is, not as a vision, though for some it is that too. Often it is simply a knowing, a sense of rightness or wrongness that does not require explanation, a pull toward something or a push away from something that operates below the level of conscious reasoning. The person who has learned to trust this knowing, to act on it even when it contradicts the ego's plans, discovers a quality of flow in their life that the forcer never experiences. Things happen with a kind of inevitability. Opportunities appear that could not have been planned. Relationships develop that could not have been forced. Success arrives that could not have been chased down because it was not the result of pursuit, but of preparation meeting possibility at exactly the right moment. The second practice is the release of attachment to outcomes. This is where the spiritual path becomes most demanding, because it asks you to want what you want without needing it, to pursue your goals without clinging to them, to invest your energy without demanding a specific return. The ego cannot do this. The ego is built on attachment. It defines itself by what it has and what it wants, and the loss of either is experienced as a diminishment of self. But the person who has learned to let God guide has discovered that their self is not defined by their outcomes. They are not their successes or their failures. They are not their relationships or their possessions. They are something larger, something that persists through change, something that can want without needing, pursue without clinging, act without demanding. This release does not mean that you stop having goals. It means that you hold your goals lightly, that you are willing to have them transformed by guidance, that you recognize that the specific form of your desire may not be what is best for you, even if the underlying essence is. You may want a particular relationship, and guidance may show you that what you actually need is the healing that the absence of that relationship is forcing you to undertake. You may want a particular career, and guidance may show you that what you actually need is the skill development that a different path is offering. You may want a particular outcome, and guidance may show you that the timing is wrong, that you are not ready, that the forcing would produce a result that you would later regret. In each case, the release of attachment allows you to receive something better than what you were demanding, something that your ego could not have imagined because it was operating from too narrow a perspective. The third practice is the acceptance of timing that is not your own. The ego wants everything now. It is impatient. It interprets delay as denial. It cannot tolerate the space between desire and fulfillment, and in that intolerance it forces. It pushes for premature commitment. It rushes processes that need time. It demands answers before the questions have fully formed. The person who lets God guide has developed a different relationship with time. They have learned that some things cannot be rushed, that certain fruits only ripen in their season, that the premature harvest is bitter. They have learned to read the signs of readiness, not just in external circumstances, but in their own internal state. They know when they are forcing because they feel the strain, the friction, the sense of swimming against the current, and they know when they are aligned because they feel the flow, the ease, the sense of being carried by something larger than their own effort. This acceptance of timing requires a kind of faith that the ego finds intolerable. Faith that the delay is not permanent. Faith that the preparation is necessary. Faith that what is meant for you will not pass you by if you are doing your part to become ready for it. This is not the passive faith of waiting for miracles. It is the active faith of preparation, of becoming the person who can hold what is coming, of doing the work that makes you ready without demanding that the opportunity appear before the work is done. It is the faith of the farmer who plants in spring and trusts the harvest in fall, not because he is lazy, but because he understands the rhythm of growth that cannot be forced by his impatience. The fourth practice is the surrender of control over other people. This is perhaps the most painful surrender because the ego's need for control is strongest in the domain of relationships. We want people to love us, to understand us, to agree with us, to stay with us, to become what we need them to be. And when they do not, the ego forces, it manipulates, it guilt trips, it performs, it withdraws. It does everything in its considerable arsenal to make the other person conform to its needs, and in the process, it destroys the very thing it is trying to preserve. Genuine connection cannot be forced. Love cannot be demanded. Understanding cannot be extracted. These are gifts that can only be given freely, and the attempt to force them creates a dynamic of coercion that poisons the well. The person who lets God guide in relationships has learned a terrible and liberating truth. You cannot control other people, and your happiness cannot depend on your ability to do so. You can only control yourself. You can only become the kind of person who attracts what you seek, who is ready for what you desire, who does not need the other person's compliance to feel whole. And then you must let the other person be free. Free to choose you or not. Free to understand you or not. Free to stay or to go. This freedom is the only foundation for genuine relationship, because only in freedom is love real. Forced love is not love. It is possession. It is fear dressed up in the costume of affection, and the person who has learned to let God guide would rather be alone in truth than accompanied in illusion. The fifth practice is the willingness to be redirected. The ego hates redirection. It experiences it as failure, as waste, as the invalidation of its plans. The person who has learned to let God guide has developed a different interpretation. They have learned that redirection is often protection, that the closed door is not a rejection but a rerouting, that the path that looks like a detour is actually the shortcut to something better than what they were pursuing. This willingness requires humility. It requires the admission that you do not know everything, that your plans are provisional, that your map is not the territory, and it requires the courage to change course when guidance indicates, even when the change is costly, even when it looks like giving up, even when everyone around you thinks you are crazy. Some of the most successful people in history have been those who were willing to be redirected. The entrepreneur who abandoned a failing business model and discovered a market they had never considered. The artist who set aside a beloved project and found their masterpiece in the work that replaced it. The person who left a relationship that looked right on paper and found a connection that was right in reality. In each case, the redirection felt like loss in the moment. It felt like failure. It required the death of a dream, the surrender of an identity, the admission that the ego had been wrong. But on the other side of that death was a rebirth that the ego could never have planned, a success that forcing could never have produced. The sixth practice is the cultivation of gratitude for what is, even when it is not what you wanted. The ego is always focused on what is missing, on the gap between reality and desire, on the injustice of not having what it believes it deserves. This focus creates a state of chronic dissatisfaction that makes guidance impossible to hear, because guidance often speaks through the present moment, and the ego is never in the present moment. It is always in the future, chasing, or in the past, regretting. The person who has learned to let God guide has cultivated the capacity to be present, to find what is good in what is, to receive the gifts that the current moment is offering, even when those gifts are not the ones that were ordered. This gratitude is not denial. It is not the toxic positivity that pretends everything is fine when it is not. It is the clear-eyed recognition that even in difficulty, even in delay, even in apparent failure, there is something to be grateful for, a lesson learned, a strength developed, a relationship revealed as unreliable before it could do more damage, a timing that is not your own, but may be better than your own. The gratitude of the person who lets God guide is hard-won. It is not the naive gratitude of the person who has not suffered. It is the mature gratitude of the person who has suffered and discovered that suffering was not meaningless, that it was shaping them, preparing them, making them ready for something that they could not have received without the preparation. The seventh practice is the maintenance of your own garden. This is the active dimension of allowing, the part that is often missed by those who misunderstand the message as passivity. You do not sit and wait for God to guide you while your life falls into disarray. You tend to your own garden. You do the work that is yours to do. You develop your character, your skills, your health, your relationships, your spiritual life. You become the best version of yourself that you can become, not because you are forcing a specific outcome, but because you are preparing for whatever outcome guidance brings. The garden is a metaphor for your life, and the gardener does not force the plants to grow. The gardener prepares the soil, plants the seeds, waters, weeds, and waits. The growth is not the gardener's doing, but the preparation is. This preparation is where your agency lives. You cannot control the harvest, but you can control the tending. You cannot control who loves you, but you can control whether you are lovable. You cannot control when opportunity comes, but you can control whether you are ready for it. The person who lets God guide is not passive. They are actively, diligently, consistently preparing. But their preparation is not anxious. It is not forced. It is the steady, patient work of someone who trusts that the harvest will come in its season and who is content to be ready when it does. The eighth practice is the release of the need to understand everything. The ego demands explanation. It needs to know why things are happening, why guidance is leading in a particular direction, why the timeline is not what was expected. This need for understanding is often the source of the greatest suffering, because guidance does not always provide explanations in advance. Sometimes the understanding only comes after the fact, sometimes years after, sometimes never in a form that the ego can process. The person who has learned to let God guide has developed a tolerance for mystery, a comfort with not knowing, a trust that operates below the level of comprehension. This does not mean that you abandon your intellect. It means that you recognize the limits of your intellect, that you do not demand that reality fit into your cognitive frameworks, that you are willing to act on guidance even when you cannot explain why. The history of human achievement is full of people who followed intuitions. They could not justify, who pursued paths that looked irrational to observers, who trusted something they could not name and were vindicated in ways that exceeded their own plans. They were not anti-intellectual, they were supra-intellectual. They used their minds as tools rather than as masters, and they were willing to follow something that their minds could not yet comprehend. The ninth practice is the acceptance of paradox. The ego loves clarity. It wants black and white, cause and effect, effort and reward. But the spiritual life, the life of guidance, is full of paradox. You must work hard without being attached to outcomes. You must pursue your goals while being willing to release them. You must be fully engaged while being fully surrendered. You must want what you want without needing it. These paradoxes cannot be resolved by the ego. They can only be held, lived, embodied. The person who has learned to let God guide has become comfortable with contradiction, has learned to hold opposing truths without collapsing into the demand for resolution. They can be ambitious and content, driven and peaceful, active and receptive. This is not confusion. It is maturity. The 10th and final practice is the recognition that the journey is the destination. The ego is always trying to get somewhere. It is always deferring life to the future, to the achievement, to the arrival. The person who has learned to let God guide has discovered that there is no arrival, or rather, that every moment is the arrival. The guidance is not taking you somewhere else. It is taking you deeper into what is. The peace you seek is not at the end of the path. It is available now in the allowing, in the surrender, in the trust. The life you want is not a future reward for present forcing. It is the natural consequence of present alignment. This recognition transforms everything. The delay is no longer a problem. The redirection is no longer a failure. The not knowing is no longer a threat. They are simply the texture of a life that is being lived in partnership with something larger than the self, something wiser than the ego, something more patient than your urgency. And in this partnership, you discover a kind of effectiveness that forcing could never produce, not because you are doing less, but because you are doing what is yours to do and allowing what is not yours to do to be handled by the intelligence that knows how. You are rowing with the current rather than against it. You are dancing with the music rather than trying to compose it. You are participating in a creation that is larger than your own ambition, and in that participation you find both peace and power. The world will tell you that you must force, that success comes to those who hustle, who grind, who refuse to take no for an answer. And there is a version of this that is true. There is work to be done. There is preparation to be made. There is discipline to be maintained. But the forcing, the white-knuckled, anxiety-driven, ego-centered compulsion to make things happen on your terms, that is not the path. That is the obstacle. It is the very thing that keeps you from hearing the guidance that would show you a better way, a right way, your way. So stop, breathe, listen. Create the stillness in which guidance can be heard. Release the attachment to outcomes that is choking your peace. Accept the timing that is not your own. Surrender the control over others that is destroying your relationships. Be willing to be redirected, even when it looks like failure. Find gratitude for what is, even when it is not what you wanted. Tend your garden with patience and without anxiety. Release the need to understand everything. Embrace the paradox, and recognize that the life you are trying to force into existence is already here, waiting for you to stop forcing long enough to receive it. Don't force anything. Let God guide you, not because you are weak, but because you are wise enough to recognize that there is a wisdom greater than your own, not because you are giving up, but because you are finally ready to win in a way that your ego could never have planned. The guidance is there. It has always been there. The only question is whether you are quiet enough, humble enough, trusting enough to hear it, and whether you are brave enough to follow where it leads, even when it leads you away from what you thought you wanted and toward what you have always needed.